I wasn't looking to betray him. I wasn't bored or unhappy. I thought I knew my limits. Then a normal day put me right on the edge of them. Nothing physical happened, but something inside me crossed a line, and I haven't felt clean since. I'm a woman in a stable relationship, or at least that's how it looks from the outside. We've built routines, plans, and a quiet kind of trust that grows when you think nothing is wrong. I wasn't searching for excitement, validation, or an escape. I was just living my life the way I always had. What happened didn't start with intention. It started with proximity, timing, and a moment where I didn't step back fast enough. I didn't plan it, I didn't invite it, but I also didn't shut it down the way I should have, and that's what's been eating at me ever since. What do you think already? Does intention matter as much as the moment itself? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this make you reflect on your own choices, subscribe and share this with someone who understands how complicated real life can be. It started in a way that feels almost embarrassing to admit, because there was nothing dramatic about it. No late nights, no secrets at first, no obvious warning signs, just a situation I'd been in 100 times before, doing something ordinary, thinking nothing of it. I remember telling myself, this is harmless. I remember feeling calm, grounded, loyal. I wasn't flirting. I wasn't trying to be seen. I was just present. That's what makes it harder now, because I didn't feel like someone about to make a mistake. Then there was a moment. Small, quiet, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A look that lasted a second too long. A comment that didn't need to be said. Nothing inappropriate on the surface, but enough to shift the air between us. I felt it in my body before my mind caught up. That subtle awareness, that spark you don't ask for but still recognize. And instead of stepping away, instead of redirecting things immediately, I stayed. I laughed. I responded. I told myself I was overthinking. What scared me wasn't the attention. It was how quickly my thoughts adjusted to it. How easily I justified staying in that moment. How part of me wanted to see where it could go, even while another part of me was quietly reminding myself who I was supposed to be. I went home that day and acted normal. I talked about my day. I smiled. I listened. And all the while, I kept replaying that moment in my head, wondering why it felt so heavy if it truly meant nothing. That's when I realized the problem wasn't what happened. It was that I didn't stop it when I still could. Do you think a line is crossed in the moment something happens, or when you choose not to walk away? After that first moment, I told myself it was over, that whatever tension I felt would fade once real life took back control. I went to sleep thinking I'd wake up feeling normal again, grounded in my relationship, embarrassed by how much I'd overanalyzed something so small. But the next day proved me wrong. What changed wasn't the situation itself, it was me. I noticed things I hadn't before, the timing, the way our paths crossed too easily, the fact that I became more aware of my appearance, my tone, my reactions. Even when I pretended not to care, I wasn't acting differently on the outside. But internally, something had shifted. I kept telling myself that awareness wasn't the same as intention, that noticing didn't mean wanting, that wanting didn't mean acting. I leaned hard on those distinctions because they made me feel safer. They allowed me to stay in control, at least on paper. But there was a part of me that felt awake in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not excited exactly, more exposed, like someone had seen a side of me I'd forgotten existed. And instead of being uncomfortable enough to shut it down, I felt curious. I started anticipating the moments we might cross paths again. Not planning them, but not avoiding them either. I told myself that avoidance would make it weird, that acting normal was the mature thing to do. Deep down, though, I knew that wasn't the full truth. The guilt didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly, in the quiet moments, when I was alone, when my partner trusted me without question. I hadn't done anything I could point to and call wrong. Yet I felt like I was carrying something private, something I wasn't sharing because I didn't want it examined too closely. That's when I started asking myself questions I didn't like. Why did this matter so much to me? Why did I care how I was perceived in that moment? And why did shutting it down feel like giving something up? I realized then that the danger wasn't temptation itself. It was how easily I was learning to live with it. Do you think emotional curiosity can be just as dangerous as action, even when nothing physical happens? By the third time it happened, I stopped pretending it was accidental. Not because anything obvious had changed on the surface, but because I could feel the pattern forming. The timing was too convenient, the familiarity too comfortable. And worst of all, I noticed how easily I slipped into that version of myself, the one that listened a little closer, smiled a little longer, and stayed present when I should have excused myself. I didn't tell myself I was doing something wrong. I told myself I was being polite. I told myself I was being mature, that adults could exist in complex situations without turning everything into a threat. That's how I framed it in my head, because that version of the story let me keep my self-image intact. But there was a quiet part of me that knew better. I started rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened. Not word for word, but emotionally. I anticipated reactions. I wondered how things would land. I noticed when I felt disappointed if an interaction ended sooner than expected. That feeling scared me more than anything else. At home, nothing looked different. We talked, ate together, shared routines. From the outside, my relationship was steady and safe. Inside, though, I felt like I was slowly separating my inner world from the life I shared with my partner. Not through lies, but through omissions. I didn't talk about my day in detail anymore. I filtered. I edited. Not because I had done something concrete, but because I didn't want to explain why something so small felt so big to me. And that silence became its own kind of secret. What unsettled me most was realizing how normal it began to feel. The tension didn't shock me anymore. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt familiar, almost manageable. And I started wondering how many people cross lines not in one dramatic step, but in a series of quiet allowances they barely notice. I kept telling myself that as long as nothing physical happened, I was still being faithful. That line became my shield. But deep down, I knew faithfulness wasn't just about actions. It was about where you let your mind linger, and what you protect from the person who trusts you most. I remember standing there one day, mid-conversation, thinking, if I don't stop this now, it's going to stop being a choice. And that thought terrified me, because I still didn't walk away. At this point, do you think I was still in control, or had I already started crossing lines without admitting it? At some point, the situation stopped feeling external and started living entirely inside me. That was the moment I understood how dangerous it had become. Not because of what was happening between us, but because of what was happening within me. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was carrying it, taking it with me when I left, letting it sit quietly in my thoughts long after the moment had passed. I caught myself checking my phone more often, even when there was no reason to, not expecting a message, exactly, but aware of the possibility. And that awareness alone felt like a betrayal I couldn't name out loud. Nothing arrived. Nothing was sent. But the anticipation itself felt loaded. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions late at night. Not dramatic ones, quiet ones. The kind you don't want answers to because they force you to look at parts of yourself you've been avoiding. I asked why this felt different from harmless interactions I'd had before. Why this specific situation lingered when others faded. The truth I didn't want to admit was that I felt seen in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. Not neglected, not unloved, just unnoticed in small, human ways. And instead of addressing that in my relationship, I let that awareness attach itself to someone else's presence. What scared me most was how easily I compartmentalized it. I didn't feel reckless. I felt controlled, responsible. I told myself that because I was aware of the danger, I was also immune to it. That belief gave me permission to stay just close enough to feel something, without taking responsibility for what that closeness meant. I remember thinking, I can manage this. I remember believing that being honest with myself was the same as being honest overall. But honesty without action is just another form of avoidance. The guilt started to change shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, constant, and easier to live with. And that scared me even more than the initial shock, because it meant I was adapting. Adjusting my boundaries without consciously lowering them. I hadn't crossed a visible line, but I had moved the line closer to me. And the closer it got, the harder it became to tell where it used to be. Do you think recognizing a boundary is enough? Or does staying near it already mean something is wrong? What finally broke something inside me wasn't a big event. It wasn't a confession, a touch, or a risky situation that got out of hand. It was a realization that came quietly, almost cruel in how subtle it was. I noticed that I had started comparing. Not consciously at first. It slipped in during ordinary moments. While listening to my partner talk, I caught myself wondering how someone else might respond to the same story. When I laughed, I wondered if my laugh sounded different in another space. When I felt tired or stressed, I noticed who came to mind first. Not to reach out to, but to imagine understanding me without explanation. That's when the guilt finally became impossible to ignore. Because comparison changes things. It means something is being weighed, even if no decision has been made yet. And once you notice yourself doing that, you can't pretend you're still standing on neutral ground. I started feeling distant at home, not because my partner had changed, but because I had. I was present physically, but internally, I felt split. Part of me was loyal, committed, and ashamed of even having these thoughts. Another part felt restless, unsettled, and frustrated with herself for caring so much about something she claimed meant nothing. I remember one night in particular. Nothing special had happened that day. No interaction, no tension, no reason to feel off. And yet, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling heavier than I should have. That's when it hit me. Even in the absence of contact, the situation was still shaping my emotional state. That terrified me, because it meant I had given something power over me without ever agreeing to it. I asked myself whether I would tell my partner any of this if they asked directly. Not because I had done something unforgivable, but because I knew how it would sound, how unnecessary it would seem, how easily it could hurt someone who hadn't done anything wrong. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding. The secrecy wasn't protecting anyone else. It was protecting me, from accountability, from discomfort, and from having to make a hard choice. I wasn't choosing between people. I was choosing between honesty and comfort. And the longer I delayed that choice, the more unfair it became to everyone involved. What shook me the most was realizing that I wasn't waiting for something to happen anymore. I was waiting to see who I would become if it didn't. At this point, do you think the real mistake was what I felt, or that I kept it to myself instead of confronting it? The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through ordinary moments, the kind that usually pass unnoticed. That was what made it so unsettling. Nothing dramatic had to happen for everything to start feeling unstable. I began noticing how careful I'd become with my words, not just what I said, but how I said it. I was constantly checking myself, measuring my tone, making sure nothing sounded off. I wasn't hiding messages or inventing stories, but I was editing reality in small ways, leaving details out, simplifying explanations, choosing silence when clarity would have been easier. And that constant self-monitoring was exhausting. I didn't realize how much energy it took until I caught myself feeling irritated over nothing. Little things started bothering me. Questions that were innocent. Routines that had always felt safe. I hated that about myself. My partner hadn't changed. Their trust hadn't changed. Yet I was reacting as if I were being watched, judged, or tested. That's when fear entered the picture. Not fear of being caught doing something wrong, but fear of being seen too clearly. Fear that if someone looked at me the right way, they'd notice the distance I was creating without admitting it. I worried about casual questions, about moments where my attention drifted, about whether my guilt was starting to show. I remember a conversation where my partner asked how my day was, genuinely curious, completely open. I answered automatically, listing tasks, responsibilities, harmless details, and then there was a pause, just a second too long, where I almost said more, almost mentioned how heavy I'd been feeling, how distracted I was, how something small had thrown me off balance. But I didn't. I swallowed it, smiled, changed the subject, and in that moment, I felt something crack. Because that was the first time I knowingly chose distance over connection. Not because I didn't care, but because caring would have required honesty, and honesty would have forced me to confront what I was avoiding. I started asking myself whether the guilt I felt was actually a signal, not a punishment, but a warning, a reminder that I was drifting away from the version of myself I trusted, the version that didn't need to justify silence or explain away discomfort. What made it worse was realizing that I still hadn't reached a breaking point. There was no clear moment telling me to stop, just a growing awareness that I was standing in a place where every next step mattered more than the last. I wasn't trapped. I could still choose differently. But choice feels heavier when you've delayed it too long. And I began to understand that consequences don't always arrive as events. Sometimes they arrive as a slow erosion of trust, of closeness, of self-respect, before anyone else even knows something is wrong. That was when I started wondering if waiting any longer was its own kind of decision. Do you think avoiding a difficult conversation can cause more damage than having it at the wrong time? The moment I had been avoiding didn't announce itself. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic revelations. It arrived quietly, wrapped in normalcy, which somehow made it heavier than anything loud ever could. I was going about my day when I realized I was no longer just managing my emotions. I was organizing my life around them. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle adjustments. I chose where to stand, when to leave, how long to stay. I told myself these were coincidences, practical decisions, nothing worth examining too closely. But deep down, I knew they weren't random anymore. That realization hit me hard. Because once you start rearranging your behavior to protect a feeling you refuse to name, you've already given it more importance than you're willing to admit. I remember feeling a sudden wave of clarity mixed with panic. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't desire. It was the awareness that this situation, whatever I kept calling it to make myself feel better, was no longer passive. It was active. It was shaping me. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had carefully avoided until then. If my partner were watching me right now, would I be proud of how I'm handling this? The answer came faster than I wanted. No. Not because I had done something concrete or irreversible, but because I was no longer fully honest with myself. I was protecting a version of the truth that made me look better, feel safer, and delay accountability just a little longer. That night, I felt an overwhelming urge to confess. Not everything, not in detail, but something. To say I was struggling. To admit I felt disconnected. To open the door to a conversation that might be uncomfortable but necessary. And yet, I froze. I imagined the confusion in my partner's face. The hurt that wouldn't make sense to them. The way I'd struggled to explain why something that never happened still mattered so much. I realized how unfair it would sound, and that fear kept me silent. But silence stopped feeling neutral. It started feeling like a choice I was actively making. A choice that benefited me while quietly costing someone else clarity and honesty. And that was a line I had always believed I wouldn't cross. I thought about how easily people judge situations like this from the outside. How simple it sounds to say, just walk away, just be honest, just shut it down. Living inside it was nothing like that. It was messy, slow, and filled with second-guessing at every step. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. If I didn't take control of this soon, the situation would take control of me. And the longer I waited, the less my eventual decision would feel like integrity, and the more it would feel like damage control. That was the first time I understood that doing nothing wasn't the same as staying loyal. Sometimes, doing nothing is exactly how you lose yourself. At this point, do you think staying silent was still a form of protection, or had it already become a betrayal of trust? What finally forced my hand wasn't temptation, it was exposure. Not exposure in the dramatic sense, No one confronted me. No secret was revealed. But the feeling that the situation had expanded beyond the space where I could safely contain it. It stopped being something I carried quietly inside and started feeling like something that could spill at any moment, without my permission. I realized this when I caught myself hesitating before responding to a simple question. A harmless one. Something that didn't deserve a pause, didn't deserve calculation. And yet there I was, weighing words, checking myself, wondering how much of the truth I could offer without revealing the tension underneath it. That pause scared me more than anything else before it, because pauses like that don't come from nothing. They come from internal conflict, from knowing that more than one version of the truth exists, and that you're actively choosing which one to present. I started feeling like I was living in two emotional timelines. One where I was committed, responsible, and deeply aware of what I stood to lose, and another where I was constantly managing a feeling I never asked for, but didn't reject forcefully enough when it arrived. Switching between those versions of myself became mentally exhausting. Sleep didn't help. Quiet moments made it worse. Late at night, I replayed conversations in my head, not because they were inappropriate, but because of what they meant to me. I analyzed my reactions, my tone, the moments where I could have redirected things more firmly, and chose not to. I asked myself whether restraint still counted as restraint if it was paired with longing. That's when the guilt shifted again. It stopped being sharp or heavy. It became persistent. The kind that sits with you during mundane tasks, while folding laundry, while brushing your teeth, while making plans for a future that suddenly felt fragile, not because it was broken, but because it was being tested quietly, without consent. I thought about what would happen if nothing changed, if this tension simply stayed unresolved, living on in my head indefinitely. I realized how unfair that would be to my partner, who trusted me without question, and to myself, who was slowly eroding her own sense of integrity by avoiding a decision. The hardest part was admitting that I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what I should do. What stopped me was the fear of consequences. Not explosive ones, but emotional ones. Conversations I couldn't control. Reactions I couldn't undo. The possibility of hurting someone without being able to justify the pain with a clear wrongdoing. I kept wishing for a clean ending. A moment where everything would naturally fade, and I could walk away without explanation, without discomfort, without having to look at the mess too closely. But life rarely offers clean exits, especially when the problem isn't an action, but an attachment. That was when it became painfully clear. I was standing at the edge of a choice I could no longer postpone. Either I confronted this, internally and externally, or I accepted that silence was no longer neutral, that it had become a form of participation. And once I understood that, I knew the next step would define more than just the situation. It would define the kind of partner and person I was willing to be. Do you think knowing the right thing to do makes it easier or harder to finally act on it? The decision didn't come with confidence. It came with exhaustion. I reached a point where holding everything inside felt heavier than any possible outcome. I was tired of monitoring myself. Tired of carrying a private tension that didn't belong in a relationship built on trust. Tired of pretending that awareness alone was enough to keep things intact. What made it harder was that nothing forced me into this moment. There was no ultimatum, no confrontation, no external pressure demanding answers. This was entirely on me, and that responsibility felt overwhelming. I spent a long time thinking about how to act, not just what to do. I knew I couldn't unload everything recklessly. I also knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I was trapped between two fears, saying too much and causing unnecessary pain, or saying too little and continuing to live dishonestly. That internal debate stretched on longer than I care to admit. I imagined different versions of the conversation. In some, I was calm and clear. In others, I stumbled, unable to explain why something that never turned physical still mattered so deeply. I worried about being misunderstood, about sounding dramatic, about being judged for feelings I never asked to have. But the truth was simpler than all those scenarios. I wasn't afraid of losing my partner. I was afraid of losing the version of myself I respected. I realized that staying silent was no longer about protecting anyone. It was about avoiding discomfort, and avoidance had already cost me more peace than honesty ever could. That realization didn't bring relief, but it brought clarity. So I chose to act, not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. I didn't confess every thought or moment. I didn't frame myself as a victim of circumstance. I acknowledged what mattered, that I had felt something I didn't expect, that I hadn't handled it perfectly, and that I needed to reestablish boundaries, internally and externally, before the situation caused real damage. Even making that choice felt like standing on unstable ground. Because once you decide to be honest, you can't control what honesty awakens. You can't predict how much pain it might cause, or how it might change the way someone looks at you. You can only decide whether you're willing to face those consequences rather than hide from them. As I prepared for what came next, I understood something I hadn't before. Integrity doesn't always feel clean or empowering in the moment. Sometimes it feels terrifying, messy, and deeply uncomfortable. But it also feels necessary. And I knew that whatever happened after this, at least I wouldn't be carrying the weight of silence alone anymore. Do you think choosing honesty late is still better than never choosing it at all? What followed wasn't dramatic, and in some ways, that was the hardest part. The conversation didn't explode into accusations or immediate conclusions. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no clear villain to point at. Instead, there was silence, the kind that fills a room when something important has just been said, and both people are trying to understand what it really means. I explained myself carefully, not defensively, not emotionally unloaded, but honestly. I didn't minimize what I felt, and I didn't exaggerate it either. I owned the fact that I had allowed something internal to grow without addressing it soon enough. I admitted that I hadn't been as present as I should have been, even if nothing physical had happened. Watching my partner process that was harder than I imagined. Not because they were angry, but because they were hurt in a quiet, restrained way, confused, trying to reconcile trust with information they never expected to receive. That's when it hit me that honesty doesn't erase impact. It just makes it visible. There were questions I couldn't fully answer. Not because I was hiding something, but because feelings don't always come with clean explanations. I could see the effort it took for them to listen without immediately reacting, and that effort humbled me more than anger ever could have. We didn't resolve everything that day. What we did do was acknowledge reality. That something had shifted, that boundaries needed to be reset, not just externally, but internally as well. That trust isn't only broken by actions, it's strained by distance, secrecy, and unspoken tension. I had to accept that even though I hadn't intended to hurt anyone, intention didn't erase consequence. And at the same time, I had to forgive myself for being human, for experiencing temptation without letting it define my character or my choices going forward. The outcome wasn't perfect. It was honest. We chose to work through it, slowly, with discomfort and clarity instead of silence. And I chose to confront parts of myself I would have preferred to ignore. That process hasn't been easy, but it has been grounding. What I learned is this: loyalty isn't proven in moments where temptation doesn't exist. It's proven in how quickly and how sincerely you respond when it does. Not by pretending you're immune, but by choosing responsibility over avoidance. I still think about that period sometimes. Not with shame, but with awareness. It reminds me how thin certain lines are, and how much they matter, even when no one else sees them. And if I'm honest, I don't believe I handled everything perfectly. But I do believe I handled it before it turned into something I couldn't stand behind. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories about relationships and moral dilemmas, subscribe to the channel for more.